When we hit a dead end in our life journey, how can we respond? When everything that can go wrong has gone wrong in our plans, what do we do? When the tasks before us seem insurmountable, how can we proceed? When people do us wrong, especially people we love, how do we deal with that? The writer of Hebrews has a simple but profound answer. We do all things by faith, which is defined as trust in God. The New Testament has few epic passages, but Hebrews 11 and 12 are one of them. It has a cadence to it. It brings together many of the flawed heroes of the Hebrew Bible, which was the Bible of Jesus and the first Christians. This is the foundation of the New Testament. Every person in this passage is a human story that we have studied in our chronological lectionary over the last 3 years. Not one of them is a stranger to us, which makes this proclamation of faith even more meaningful. The author also remembers the great time of suffering during the Maccabean revolt. This upheaval began with a crushing purge of the Jews in Jerusalem in the times between the Old and the New Testaments. A mad and raging ruler named Antiochus attacked Jerusalem, killing 80,000 Jews. He began a torturous frenzy against the survivors for no particular reason. The temple was ransacked, offerings to Zeus were made on the holy altar, and the temple chambers were made into brothels. The description of the tortures, the stonings, beheadings, and even being sawed in two were from a time only 200 years before the writing of Hebrews. And we might compare that to our remembrance of the horrors of our own Civil War, whose last veteran died in 1956, which is in the lifetime of many of us in this sanctuary. So this suffering that the author talks about is not ancient history to the readers of Hebrews. It still has its raw edges. And so in the face of this kind of hatred, pain, racism, suffering, what was the response of God's people? They had faith in God, who made a promise of salvation to all. While the main passage of this excellent prose is to hold on to our faith, the writer also tells us something wonderful. We are not in this alone. We not only have one another, but we have a great cloud of witnesses to our faith, surrounding us at all times, cheering us on, offering their own stories as examples for us, and telling us to keep going. This cloud of witnesses is like a stadium filled with our fans, cheering, shouting words of encouragement, and praying for us as we run the race of life. In fact, when we are struggling the most, when all the breath seems to have just gone out of us, and when our muscles are cramped and straining from the running, they will even come down out of the stadium and run with us so that we're not alone. If you ever watched a long-distance running race, especially a high school or college race, you might have seen those who had finished go back on the track and run beside those who weren't sure they could finish. They shout things like, "You've got this. You can do this. Keep going. I'm with you. We're going to finish this together." It's a moving thing to see and can often bring tears to our eyes as even the opponents of each other's teams help one another to get to the finish line. And this is what the apostle of the Hebrews is getting at. There's no mention in this passage of winning the race. And yes, I know that totally goes against our culture. There's only mention about showing up and running, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, and knowing that sooner or later, no matter what, we will finish. It doesn't matter if we have to pause during the race. It doesn't even matter if we get off track. Our ancestors did that. It doesn't even matter if we are the last one over the finish line, because guess what? The after party doesn't start until everyone gets there. God is keeping the gates open, and the heavenly banquet won't begin until everyone has finished the race and arrived. I know that we're living in difficult times, times of upheaval, suffering, times in which we do not always know how to understand what is going on in our country and in our denomination. The apostle to the Hebrews reminds us that others have gone before us in the same and even worse circumstances. Our faith is in God, and we have this great chain of witnesses that the apostle recounts of generations who lead us, like a chain in which each is linked together and also linked to us. There is nothing more intimate than the faith we share. Our trust in God has set us on this course, and it is God who will stand at the finish line with divine arms outreached to catch each and every one of us. In the struggle to maintain our faith, which by the world's standards doesn't always win in the short term, we are to do our part to keep the chain moving forward until we have all reached that final goal. The goal is that the great chain of witnesses remains unbroken and continues to move forward in the cause of God's grace until that work comes to completion by renewing the whole face of creation. That renewal will be signaled by all of creation crossing the finish line and rejoicing in our heavenly home. Now, we might find the faith of Rahab and Gideon and Samuel far removed from our daily lives, and that's okay, as long as we know their stories. but we can also count on the witnesses that are closer to our own age. Who are the people who have witnessed to you and encouraged your faith? And name them. They have come from your close circle of friends, or be people whose faith has encouraged you recently, like someone in the news, or leaders who are prophetic, like Bishops Desmond Tutu or Gene Robinson, or even someone you've heard speak on NPR or YouTube. Think of your heroes in faith, witnesses that can cheer you on and inspire you to keep moving ahead. We are all in this together, and we are not alone. Pastor and author John Ortberg tells the story of an evening when he was walking with some friends in Newport Beach, California. As they walked past one of the local bars, a fight spilled out into the street like a scene from the Old West. As they watched, 3 men proceeded to beat up a single opponent who was already bleeding quite freely. Well, they realized that they had to do something, even though they didn't have a lot of experience in that sort of thing. In fact, Ortberg writes that breaking up drunken brawls was not a strong area of spiritual passion or competence for any of them. And in spite of that, they went over to speak prophetically to the aggressors, feeling pretty certain that once they intervened, they would easily become the next targets. But as they began to warn the men to break it up, suddenly the thugs looked up with fear in their eyes, let their victim not go, and turned away and walked. At that point, he realized that the men were actually looking over his shoulder. So he turned around and saw what he describes as one of the biggest men he had ever seen. Ortberg writes, he stood 6'7" and weighed about 250 pounds or so, with perhaps 2% body fat. If Hercules had married Xena, the warrior princess, this would have been their child. He goes on to say, we called him Mongo, but not to his face. And Mongo didn't say a word. He just stood there with muscles bulging, looking as if he hoped the thugs would try to take him on. He was the bouncer from the bar. And this was an area of massive, breathtaking competence for him. Breaking up fights was Mongo's spiritual gift. And in that moment, when he realized what had happened, John Ortberg's attitude was transformed. He was released from anxiety and fear. He was filled with boldness and confidence. And we better not catch you hanging around here again, he shouted. Why? Because we realized he was not alone. Mongo had his back. Someone was standing beside him who was more than capable of dealing with the situation. We are stronger together than we are alone. This is an important message in the scriptures. And the apostle to the Hebrews writes, not one of these people, even though their lives of faith were exemplary, got their hands on what was promised. God had a better plan for us, that their faith and our faith would come together to make one completed whole. their lives and faith not complete apart from us.